The autumn wind swept through Whitefish, Montana, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. It was September 1997, and the town nestled against Glacier National Park was preparing for the quiet months ahead, when tourists would abandon the trails and locals would reclaim their mountains. Sarah Mitchell had arrived 3 days earlier, a 28-year-old landscape photographer from Portland who'd rented a room above the Mountain View Cafe on Central Avenue. The proprietor, Agnes Hartley, remembered her as polite but distant, the kind of person who smiled without showing her teeth. Sarah had spread topographical maps across the small table in her room, marking trails with a yellow highlighter. Agnes had knocked once to bring fresh towels and noticed the careful annotations, the circled areas around Jewel Basin and the Bob Marshall Wilderness. "Those are some serious hikes you're planning," Agnes had said, but Sarah only nodded, folding the maps with deliberate precision. She wore her dark hair pulled back tight, and her grey eyes had a faraway quality that made Agnes think of someone running from something, though she couldn't say what. On September 14th, Sarah left before dawn. Agnes heard the old stairs creak at 5:30 in the morning, heard the soft click of the front door. Through her bedroom window, she watched Sarah load a green backpack into a faded blue Honda Civic, watched the taillights disappear down the empty street. It was the last confirmed sighting of Sarah Mitchell alive. When Sarah didn't return by the 17th, Agnes contacted the Flathead County Sheriff's Department. Deputy Marcus Cole took the report, a weathered man of 45 who'd grown up hunting these mountains and knew their dangers intimately. Sarah's car was found 2 days later at the Jewel Basin trailhead, locked and undisturbed. Her registration showed a Portland address. Inside the vehicle, deputies found protein bars, a first aid kit, and a journal with the last entry, dated September 13th. Tomorrow. Finally, tomorrow. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. The search began immediately. Marcus organized volunteers from town, experienced hikers and hunters who knew every ridge and valley. They combed the trails radiating from Jewel Basin, calling Sarah's name until their voices went hoarse. Helicopters from Kalispell swept overhead, thermal imaging cameras scanning the dense forest canopy, but the wilderness swallowed their efforts. 27 miles of maintained trails branched into countless game paths and unmarked routes. A person could walk for weeks and never see another human soul. Sarah's parents, Robert and Catherine Mitchell, drove from Portland, their faces carved with grief and desperate hope. They stayed at the Mountain View, in the same room Sarah had occupied, and Catherine would sit for hours touching the things her daughter had touched, as if proximity might reveal some hidden truth. Robert posted flyers throughout Whitefish, Kalispell, and Columbia Falls, his daughter's photograph staring from every storefront window and telephone pole. "Have you seen this woman?" The question hung unanswered in the mountain air. Marcus interviewed everyone who might have crossed paths with Sarah. The gas station attendant remembered her filling up on the 13th, buying a pack of batteries and a disposable camera. The clerk at the outdoor supply store recalled selling her bear spray and waterproof matches, but no one had seen her on the trail. It was as if she'd walked into the forest and dissolved like morning mist. As September turned to October, the search radius expanded. Teams pushed deeper into the Bob Marshall Wilderness, that vast million-acre expanse of roadless backcountry where grizzly bears outnumbered people. They checked abandoned ranger stations and old mining camps, places where someone injured or disoriented might seek shelter. They found nothing. The first snow fell on October 9th, dusting the high peaks white, and Marcus knew they were running out of time. Catherine Mitchell refused to leave. While Robert returned to Portland to manage their bookstore, Catherine remained in Whitefish through October and into November, joining search parties until the snow made the trails impassable. She walked until her feet bled, called her daughter's name until her voice was a broken whisper. Agnes would find her some mornings sitting in the cafe before dawn, staring at nothing, her coffee grown cold in the cup. "She's out there," Catherine would say. "I can feel it. She's waiting for us to find her." But as winter locked its grip on the mountains, even Catherine had to accept defeat. She left Whitefish on November 23rd, the day before Thanksgiving, driving away in their family Volvo, with Sarah's belongings packed in boxes. Marcus stood in the cafe parking lot and watched her go, feeling the weight of failure settle into his bones. The case remained open, but dormant through the winter of 1997 and into 1998. Marcus kept Sarah's file on his desk, reviewing it during quiet shifts, searching for something he'd missed. He'd pull out the topographical maps found in her room, studying the areas she'd marked. Most circled the popular trails around Jewel Basin, but one mark stood out, a small X drawn in red ink deep in the Bob Marshall wilderness, far from any maintained trail, near a place old-timers called Dead Horse Ridge. He'd asked Catherine about it during one of their many conversations. She'd shaken her head, bewildered. Sarah was an experienced hiker, but she wasn't reckless. She wouldn't go that far off-trail alone, yet the mark remained unexplained, like so many aspects of her disappearance. Time moved forward, as it always does. Robert and Catherine hired private investigators who found nothing. They offered a $10,000 reward for information. They appeared on local news programs, their faces aging with each broadcast, hope dimming in their eyes like a guttering candle. Other cases demanded Marcus's attention: domestic disputes, bar fights, the occasional drug bust. Life in Whitefish continued its rhythm, though some part of the town's innocence had been carved away by Sarah's absence. Agnes kept Sarah's room empty for 6 months, irrationally convinced she might return. When she finally rented it to a fishing guide from Minnesota, she felt like a traitor. She donated the money from that first rental to the Missing Persons Foundation Catherine had established. It felt like the least she could do. By the summer of 1999, Sarah Mitchell had become another name in the long list of people swallowed by America's wilderness. The mountains kept their secrets, as they always had. It was a bow hunter named Dale Pritchard who found her, or what remained of her, on August 7, 1999. Dale had been tracking an elk deep into the Bob Marshall wilderness, miles from the nearest trail, when he noticed something unnatural in a small clearing surrounded by ancient pines. At first, he thought it was a deer carcass, the way animals look when bears and coyotes have finished with them. But as he approached, his rifle raised instinctively, he saw the fabric, synthetic, bright blue, the kind used for technical outdoor gear. Dale had served in Vietnam. He'd seen death in forms that haunted his sleep decades later, but standing in that clearing, looking at what he'd found, his hands shook so badly he nearly dropped his rifle. He backed away slowly, marking the location on his GPS unit, then practically ran the 6 miles back to his truck. He drove straight to the Flathead County Sheriff's Department, barely coherent, and asked for Marcus Cole. Marcus reached the site by late afternoon, leading a recovery team that included 2 deputies, a forensic technician from Missoula, and the county coroner, Dr. Helen Zhao. They'd flown in by helicopter, the only way to access that remote location quickly. As they hiked the final half-mile from the clearing where the pilot had set down, Marcus felt his chest tighten with the certainty of what they would find. The remains lay in a shallow depression, partially obscured by 2 years of fallen pine needles and forest debris. Animals had scattered the bones, but enough remained to confirm it was human. The blue fabric Dale had spotted was a jacket, technical gear of the type Sarah Mitchell had been wearing when she disappeared. Nearby, they found fragments of a backpack, its green material faded and torn. But it was Dr. Zhao who noticed what made this discovery extraordinary and deeply disturbing. She knelt beside the skull, using a small brush to clear away dirt and needles, and her breath caught. "Marcus," she said quietly, "you need to see this." The skull bore markings, shallow grooves carved into the bone, forming distinct patterns. Similar marks appeared on several other bones, scattered in the clearing: the left femur, 2 ribs, part of the pelvis. They weren't random scratches from animal activity. These were deliberate, made with a sharp tool, possibly a knife. The patterns were geometric, almost ritualistic, circles within circles, radiating lines, symbols that looked like distorted letters or numbers. Marcus had investigated deaths before: car accidents, hunting mishaps, one murder-suicide that still made him sick to remember. But nothing had prepared him for this. He stood in that clearing as afternoon shadows lengthened and felt a cold certainty settle over him. Sarah Mitchell hadn't simply gotten lost and died of exposure. Something else had happened here, something that transformed a missing person case into something far darker. They worked until the light failed, documenting everything, carefully collecting evidence. Dr. Zhao supervised the removal of the remains, ensuring every bone was accounted for, photographed and catalogued. The forensic technician took soil samples, searching for any trace evidence that might have survived 2 years of weather and decomposition. Marcus walked the perimeter of the clearing in widening circles, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. He found Sarah's camera 30 feet from the remains, wedged between rocks and partially buried. The plastic case was cracked and dirt-filled, but the disposable camera inside might still be salvageable. He bagged it carefully, knowing it might hold the only images of Sarah's final hours. They also recovered fragments of her identification, a water bottle and 1 hiking boot. The other boot and most of her gear remained missing, likely dragged away by scavengers. As darkness fell, and they prepared to hike back to the helicopter, Marcus stood alone in the clearing for a moment. The forest was silent, except for the wind moving through the pines, a sound like whispered secrets. He thought about Sarah's mother, about the phone call he would have to make, about the answers he didn't have. Finding a body brought closure, but these symbols, these deliberate markings carved into bone, they opened doors to questions that made his blood run cold. The location troubled him deeply. Dead Horse Ridge was more than 12 miles from the Jewel Basin trailhead where Sarah's car had been found, across difficult terrain with no marked trails. How had she gotten here? And more disturbing, the red X on her map, the one that had puzzled him for 2 years. When he checked his GPS coordinates against Sarah's map back at the station, he realized the marks on her map indicated almost exactly where her remains had been found. Sarah Mitchell had marked her own grave before she died. The discovery of Sarah's remains transformed the investigation overnight. What had been a missing person case, filed away and gathering dust, became a potential homicide that drew attention from state and federal agencies. FBI agents from the Missoula field office arrived in Whitefish within 48 hours, led by Special Agent Jennifer Torres, a woman in her late 30s with sharp eyes and a reputation for solving complex cases. Marcus found himself both grateful for the help and resentful of the intrusion. These were his mountains, his case, his failure. But he recognized the truth. The markings on Sarah's remains suggested something beyond the scope of small-town law enforcement. If someone had murdered Sarah Mitchell and carved symbols into her bones, that person might still be in the area, might strike again. Dr. Zhao conducted the autopsy in Kalispell, with Marcus and Agent Torres present. The examination room was cold and clinical, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of antiseptic failing to mask the odor of death. Helen worked with quiet precision, measuring and photographing each bone, cataloging every detail. The body had been skeletonized, making cause of death difficult to determine, but certain facts emerged. Sarah had suffered a broken left wrist at some point before death. The bone showed signs of healing, suggesting the injury had occurred days or even weeks earlier. Several ribs showed fractures consistent with a fall from height, though whether this was before or after death remained unclear. But most significant were the carved marks. Under magnification they were unmistakable, deliberate incisions made with a sharp blade, probably a hunting knife, applied with enough force to score the bone. These were made peri-mortem, or shortly after death, Helen explained, pointing to microscopic details in the cuts. If she'd been dead for more than a few hours, the bone would have responded differently to the blade. And there's no sign of healing, which would occur if she'd survived with these injuries. So someone killed her and then carved these symbols, Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Or carved them while she was dying, Helen said quietly. I can't rule that out. The symbols themselves defied easy interpretation. Agent Torres brought in a professor from the University of Montana who specialized in symbology and anthropology. Dr. Raymond Beck spent 2 days studying photographs of the markings, comparing them to databases of known symbols, from ancient petroglyphs to modern gang tags. He found no matches. They're not Native American, not any tribe from this region or anywhere else I can identify, he explained in a conference room at the sheriff's department, his laptop displaying enhanced images of the bone carvings. They're not Masonic, not occult symbols from any recognized tradition. They could be completely original, created by whoever did this, or they could be corrupted versions of symbols from multiple sources, mixed together. What about meaning? Torres pressed. Do they convey anything? Beck shrugged helplessly. Without context, symbols are just marks. They mean what their creator intends them to mean. These could be religious, ritualistic, or completely meaningless, just the scribblings of a disturbed mind. The camera recovered from the scene offered another piece of the puzzle. The lab in Missoula managed to develop the film, though water and time had damaged many frames. Of the 27 exposures, only 9 produced any image, and most were too degraded to show useful detail, but 3 photographs were clear enough to break Marcus's heart. The first showed Sarah alive, smiling, standing at a mountain vista with Glacier National Park spread behind her. The photo was dated by the lab to early September, probably the 13th or 14th. She looked healthy, happy even, her face turned toward the sun. The second photo showed her camp, a small blue tent pitched in a clearing surrounded by pines. The third photo was the one that would haunt Marcus for years to come. It showed Sarah's hand, extended toward the camera as if she were taking a selfie. But her hand was covered in blood, and behind it, barely visible in the dim light, was the terrified expression on her face. The angle suggested she'd been lying down, holding the camera above her. The timestamp placed it on September 15th, 2 days after she'd left Whitefish. The remaining photos were too damaged to interpret, showing only abstract smears of color and shadow. Whatever Sarah had photographed in her final hours remained locked away, dissolved by time and the elements. Marcus called Robert and Catherine Mitchell from his office, Agent Torres seated across from him. It was one of the hardest conversations of his life. He told them about the discovery, about the confirmation through dental records, about the investigation now underway. He did not tell them about the symbols carved into their daughter's bones. Some details could wait until they arrived, until he could soften the blow with his presence. Catherine's cry through the phone line cut through him like a blade. Robert's voice, when he could speak, was hollow, emptied of everything except pain. They would drive up immediately, they said. They would leave within the hour. Marcus promised to meet them, to tell them everything, to find who had done this to their daughter. After the call, Marcus sat in silence while Torres reviewed notes on her laptop. Finally, he spoke. the marked location on her map. She knew where she was going to die. "Maybe," Torres said, "or maybe someone made her mark it, a kind of game, forcing her to choose or predict her own death." The thought made Marcus's stomach turn. Who does something like that? Torres closed her laptop and met his eyes. Someone who's done it before, or someone who will do it again. The investigation expanded rapidly. Torres brought in additional agents to canvass the area, interviewing anyone who'd been in the Bob Marshall Wilderness during September 1997. Hunting guides, backpackers, forestry workers, anyone who might have seen something unusual. They reviewed permits and registrations, cross-referenced names with criminal databases, searched for patterns. They found dozens of people who'd been in the general area, but the wilderness was vast, and most had been miles from Dead Horse Ridge. One name appeared that drew their attention: Leonard Cross, a 42-year-old from Columbia Falls who'd had a hunting permit for the Bob Marshall Wilderness that September. Leonard had a history, assault charges from 15 years earlier, dismissed on a technicality, and a reputation around Columbia Falls as someone best avoided. He lived alone in a cabin 30 miles north of Whitefish, worked sporadically as a carpenter, and spent most of his time in the mountains. Marcus and Torres drove to Leonard's cabin on August 12th, accompanied by 2 state troopers. The structure sat at the end of a rutted dirt road, surrounded by dense forest, a place where neighbors were miles away and sound didn't carry. Leonard answered the door after the 3rd knock, a tall man with a grey beard and suspicious eyes. He invited them in with visible reluctance. The cabin's interior was sparse and meticulously organized. Too organized, Marcus thought, like someone who needed complete control over his environment. Hunting trophies lined the walls: elk, deer, mountain goat, and a massive grizzly bear head that seemed to watch them with glass eyes. A workbench in the corner displayed an array of knives, each one clean and carefully arranged. Torres conducted the interview while Marcus observed. Leonard admitted to being in the Bob Marshall Wilderness during September 1997, but claimed he'd been nowhere near Dead Horse Ridge. He'd been hunting elk in the northern section, near Spotted Bear, he said, and had seen no one unusual. When Torres showed him Sarah's photograph, he studied it with unsettling intensity before shaking his head. Never seen her. Lot of people go into those mountains, though. Most of them aren't prepared. Mountains don't forgive mistakes. What about these symbols? Torres showed him photographs of the carvings, watching his reaction carefully. Leonard's face remained impassive. Looks like somebody trying to be clever, or crazy. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. They searched the cabin with Leonard's consent, finding nothing directly incriminating. The knives were all hunting tools, commonly owned by thousands of people. No trophies from Sarah, no evidence connecting him to the crime. But as they were leaving, Marcus noticed something: a topographical map of the Bob Marshall Wilderness tacked to the wall, marked with various notations. Among the marks was a small circle around Dead Horse Ridge. "You hunt there?" Marcus asked, pointing. Leonard glanced at the map. "Used to, long time ago. Good country for elk, but hard to access. Gave it up years ago." They had no grounds to arrest him, no evidence beyond circumstantial details and instinct. As they drove away, Torres was quiet, thinking. Finally, she said, "He's hiding something." "I know," Marcus agreed, "but knowing and proving are different things." The investigation continued through August and into September. Tips came in from across Montana and neighboring states, people claiming to have seen Sarah or to know who killed her, or to have expertise in deciphering the symbols. Most led nowhere. The FBI brought in profilers who suggested they were looking for someone intelligent, organized, likely with military or survival training, someone who knew the wilderness intimately and could move through it invisibly. Sarah's parents returned to Whitefish for a memorial service at the end of August. The town turned out in force, filling the small Episcopal church on Baker Avenue. People who'd never met Sarah came to pay respects, to acknowledge the darkness that had touched their community. Catherine spoke, her voice steady despite tears, talking about her daughter's love of wild places, her talent for finding beauty in desolate landscapes, her gentle spirit. After the service, Catherine pulled Marcus aside. Her face had aged years in the months since Sarah's disappearance, grief etched into every line. "Find him," she said simply. "Whoever did this, whatever it takes, please." Marcus promised he would, knowing it was a promise he might not be able to keep. But he meant it with every fiber of his being. As September turned to October 1999, the investigation reached a frustrating stalemate. Despite extensive work by the FBI and local law enforcement, no solid evidence linked anyone to Sarah's murder. Leonard Cross remained a person of interest, but surveillance revealed nothing incriminating. He lived his solitary life, worked occasional carpentry jobs, disappeared into the mountains for days at a time, and returned without incident. Agent Torres was recalled to Missoula to work on other cases, though she kept the Mitchell case file active and continued to consult with Marcus regularly. The reality of law enforcement was that resources were finite, and without new leads, the investigation had to be scaled back. Marcus understood this intellectually, but fought against it emotionally. He couldn't let go. He spent his off-duty hours researching similar cases, searching for patterns. He contacted law enforcement agencies throughout Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, inquiring about unsolved disappearances in wilderness areas, especially those involving strange circumstances. Most yielded nothing useful, but one caught his attention. In 1994, a young man named Thomas Chen had disappeared while hiking in Idaho's Sawtooth Wilderness. His remains had been found 6 months later by Forest Service workers. The autopsy report, which Marcus obtained through official channels, noted unusual markings on several bones, origin undetermined. The case had been investigated as a possible homicide, but never solved. Marcus contacted the detective who'd handled it, a retired officer named Bill Henderson. They spoke by phone, comparing notes. Bill described the symbols found on Thomas Chen's remains, geometric patterns, circles and lines carved into bone. They weren't identical to those found on Sarah, but they shared similarities, deliberate, precise, seemingly ritualistic. Thomas had been an experienced hiker, 25 years old, from Seattle. He'd been backpacking alone when he vanished. "Did you have any suspects?" Marcus asked. "One," Bill said, "a guy with a history of violence, known to frequent that area. We brought him in, questioned him, searched his property. Nothing. Never could make anything stick. He died 3 years ago, heart attack. I always thought we missed something, that he knew more than he told us." Marcus felt a chill. What was his name? Dale Pritchard. The name hung in the air like smoke. Dale Pritchard, the bow hunter who'd found Sarah's remains. Marcus's mind raced, connections forming and dissolving. Could it be coincidence? Dale had seemed genuinely shaken when he'd reported the discovery, his distress authentic. But sociopaths were skilled actors. He called Agent Torres immediately, laying out the connection. She returned to Whitefish the next day, and together they drove to Dale's home, a ranch-style house on the outskirts of town. Dale's wife, Marie, answered the door, her face puzzled by their presence. Dale was at work, she said, managing the hardware store on Highway 93. They found him there, restocking shelves, and brought him to the sheriff's department for questioning. Dale sat across from them in the interview room, confused and cooperative. Yes, he'd known Thomas Chen's case. He'd been questioned about it at the time because he'd been in the Sawtooth Wilderness that summer, hunting. But he'd had nothing to do with the young man's death. He'd been cleared, he said, his voice rising with indignation. And finding Sarah Mitchell's remains had been traumatic, a nightmare that woke him some nights in cold sweats. Torres pressed him about his presence in both locations, about his knowledge of the wilderness, about whether he recognized the symbols. Dale's answers were consistent, his alibi for September 1997 solid. He'd been working at the hardware store, with dozens of time cards and witnesses to prove it. His hunting trip that August 1999 had been his first major outing in months due to a back injury. After 3 hours, they had to let him go. His connection to both cases appeared to be nothing more than tragic coincidence, the random intersection of one man's life with two terrible crimes. But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that they were missing a piece that would make the puzzle suddenly clear. That piece arrived on October 17th in the form of a letter addressed to Marcus at the sheriff's department. It was postmarked from Missoula, sent to a generic address, typed on plain white paper. The text was brief. The mountains remember what men forget. Look where the water runs backwards and the trees grow in circles. She wasn't the first. She won't be the last. The symbols tell the story if you know how to read them. There was no signature. No return address. Forensics found no fingerprints, no DNA, no fibers. Whoever had sent it had been careful, but the message itself opened new avenues. Marcus pulled out topographical maps, looking for places where water runs backwards, possibly artesian springs or unusual geological formations, places where trees grow in circles, perhaps areas of unusual growth patterns, maybe indicating old structures or natural phenomena. He found 3 possibilities within the Bob Marshall wilderness, all remote, all difficult to access. With winter approaching, they had a narrow window to investigate. Torres assembled a team, herself, Marcus, 2 FBI agents, and a local guide named Thomas Redstone, a member of the Blackfeet Nation who knew the wilderness as well as anyone living. They flew in by helicopter on October 23rd, investigating the first site, a geological formation near Schaefer Meadows, where an underground spring created the illusion of water flowing uphill. They found nothing unusual. The second site, near Cabin Creek, showed stands of lodgepole pines growing in circular patterns, likely the result of fire ecology, but no evidence of human activity. The third site was different. Located near the headwaters of the South Fork of the Flathead River, they found a clearing where pine trees did indeed grow in an almost perfect circle, approximately 40 feet in diameter. The pattern was too precise to be natural, suggesting the trees had been deliberately planted decades earlier, perhaps in the early 20th century, when miners had worked these mountains. In the center of the circle, they found a stone cairn, carefully constructed, about 3 feet high. When they dismantled it, they discovered items that made Marcus's blood run cold: a rusted hunting knife, fragments of clothing including a woman's hiking boot that didn't match Sarah's, and a small, waterproof notebook. The notebook's pages were filled with the same type of symbols found carved on Sarah's bones. Page after page of circles and lines, geometric patterns, and text written in a code or language none of them recognized. Some pages included dates going back to 1983. Others contained what appeared to be names or initials: T.C., M.B., S.M., Sarah Mitchell. They'd found a killer's journal, a record spanning 16 years, possibly documenting multiple victims. The FBI rushed the notebook to Quantico for analysis. Handwriting experts, codebreakers, and forensic linguists worked to decipher its contents. Meanwhile, Marcus coordinated with agencies across the Northwest, searching records for unsolved disappearances matching the initials in the notebook. They found 5. Thomas Chen, 1994, Sawtooth Wilderness, Idaho. Michelle Barker, 1988, Wind River Range, Wyoming. Deborah Foster, 1991, Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness, Montana. James Nolan, 1983, Bob Marshall Wilderness, Montana. And Sarah Mitchell, 1997. All were experienced hikers who disappeared alone in wilderness areas. All had been found months or years later, and in the cases where remains were sufficient, all showed the same unusual bone markings. The FBI had stumbled onto what appeared to be a serial killer who'd been operating for 16 years, using America's vast wilderness as his hunting ground. But who? The notebook revealed the what, but not the who. Analysis of the handwriting suggested someone educated, methodical, possibly with military training based on certain abbreviations and formatting. The symbols, experts finally determined, were a personal code, mixing elements from various sources, navigation symbols, astrological signs, mathematical notations, creating a unique language. One passage, partially decoded, chilled everyone who read it. They come seeking solitude and find it forever. The mountains are my cathedral, and I am their priest. Each mark is a prayer, each death a communion. They were hunting a man who saw himself as conducting some kind of ritual, who viewed murder as a spiritual practice. And he was still out there, somewhere in the vastness of Montana's wilderness. The discovery of the journal transformed the investigation into a manhunt that drew national attention. News outlets across the country reported on the wilderness killer, and the FBI formed a task force dedicated to identifying and capturing him. But finding one person in millions of acres of roadless backcountry, someone who knew the terrain intimately and had evaded detection for 16 years, proved extraordinarily difficult. The task force, now numbering 20 agents plus state and local officers, focused on building a profile. Their killer was likely male, between 40 and 60 years old, physically fit enough to handle extreme wilderness conditions, and possessed extensive outdoor skills. He probably lived in or near western Montana, had minimal social connections, and likely had a history that would include military service, survival training, or extensive guiding experience. They cross-referenced this profile against residents of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, particularly those with connections to the areas where victims had disappeared. Thousands of names populated their database. They worked to eliminate suspects systematically, checking alibis, investigating backgrounds, conducting interviews. Leonard Cross remained high on the list, but they still had no direct evidence linking him to any of the crimes. Marcus worked 18-hour days, driven by a need for justice that had become almost obsessive. His wife, Jennifer, worried about him, about the toll this case was taking on his health and their marriage. They'd had 20 good years together, raised 2 children, who were now in college, built a life in Whitefish they both loved. But she'd never seen him like this, haunted, driven, barely sleeping. "You can't save her," Jennifer said one night in late October, finding him at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, surrounded by files and photographs. "Sarah's gone. You did everything you could." "But the others aren't gone," Marcus replied. "Somewhere out there, someone else might be planning their last hike. If we don't stop him, there will be more." Jennifer sat beside him, took his hand. "Then let the FBI handle it. They have the resources, the expertise. You're destroying yourself." Marcus knew she was right, but he couldn't let go. This had become personal in a way he couldn't fully explain. Maybe it was Catherine Mitchell's eyes, the trust she'd placed in him. Maybe it was his own failure to find Sarah before she'd died. Or maybe it was simply that evil had touched his mountains, his home, and he couldn't rest while it remained unpunished. The break came from an unexpected source. On November 3rd, a man walked into the FBI field office in Missoula and asked to speak to someone about the Wilderness Killer case. His name was David Cross, and he was Leonard Cross's younger brother. The two men had been estranged for years, David explained, but he'd been following the news coverage and had information he thought might be relevant. Agent Torres interviewed him for 4 hours, recording every word. David described a childhood with Leonard that had been marked by violence and control. Their father had been abusive, a Korean War veteran who'd brought the war home with him, and Leonard had internalized their father's rage. As teenagers, Leonard had tortured small animals, behavior that had terrified David. When their parents died in a car accident in 1982, Leonard had inherited the family cabin and withdrawn from society. But it was David's next revelation that electrified the investigation. In the summer of 1983, Leonard had invited David on a hunting trip in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. During that trip, they'd encountered a young man hiking alone, James Nolan, though David hadn't known his name at the time. Leonard had insisted they follow the hiker, had shown an unsettling interest in tracking the young man's movements. David had felt uncomfortable and had hiked out early, leaving Leonard alone in the wilderness. When James Nolan's disappearance had made the news that fall, David had felt sick with suspicion, but had convinced himself it was coincidence. He'd been young, afraid of his brother, and unsure what to do. Over the years, as more hikers disappeared, and he'd gradually heard rumors about Leonard's presence in various wilderness areas at relevant times, his suspicions had grown. But it was seeing Sarah Mitchell's photograph, seeing the symbols carved into bone, that had finally broken through his denial. Leonard has books on symbols, on codes, on ancient rituals, David said. He's obsessed with the idea of marking things, claiming them. When we were kids, he'd carve his initials into trees, into rocks, into everything. He had to leave his mark. Torres asked the crucial question, would he have kept evidence? Trophies from his victims? David thought for a long moment. Leonard keeps everything. He's meticulous, organized. If he took items from these people, they'd be somewhere in that cabin, probably hidden. But there. Getting a search warrant based on a brother's suspicions and circumstantial evidence was challenging, but Torres was persuasive. She presented the case to a federal judge, emphasizing the urgency. With winter setting in, if Leonard Cross was indeed the killer, he would be planning his next victim for the following spring. They needed to act now. The warrant was issued on November 5th. At 6 in the morning on November 6th, a team of FBI agents, state troopers, and Marcus descended on Leonard Cross's cabin. Leonard answered the door in pajamas, his face registering surprise, followed quickly by cold anger. He said nothing as they presented the warrant, simply stepped aside and watched as agents swarmed through his home. The search lasted 8 hours. They examined every inch of the cabin, the workshop, a storage shed, even digging in areas around the property where ground-penetrating radar suggested disturbances. They found Leonard's symbol notebooks, matching the one discovered in the stone cairn. They found detailed topographical maps marked with locations corresponding to where victims had disappeared. They found photographs of wilderness areas, some including distant figures that might be hikers. But the most damning evidence was found in a locked metal box buried beneath the floorboards of the workshop. Inside were items that would seal Leonard's fate: a driver's license belonging to Michelle Barker, a watch engraved with Thomas Chen's initials, a small silver cross necklace that Sarah's parents would later confirm had belonged to their daughter, and items from the other victims. Trophies, kept and hidden, connecting Leonard Cross to 16 years of murder. Leonard was arrested without incident. He said nothing, exercised his right to an attorney, and maintained complete silence throughout processing. But his eyes, Marcus noticed, held no fear, No remorse, only a kind of cold curiosity, as if he were observing an interesting experiment. The FBI found more as they processed the evidence, detailed journals describing each victim, how Leonard had stalked them, learned their patterns, chosen his moments. He'd followed hikers for days sometimes, watching from a distance, waiting for the perfect isolation. He'd approached them under various pretenses: a fellow hiker needing help, someone who'd seen an injured animal, a guide offering directions. Once he'd gained their trust enough to get close, the violence had been swift. The symbols, experts finally understood, were Leonard's way of claiming his victims, marking them as his own. Each symbol was personal, derived from something he'd learned about the victim, their interests, their fears, their beliefs. Sarah's symbols, analysis revealed, included elements from photography, suggesting Leonard had learned about her profession. Thomas Chen's included mathematical symbols reflecting his engineering background. The murders weren't just killings, they were Leonard's twisted attempt to possess his victims completely, to reduce them to symbols he'd created. The trial began in March 2000. Leonard Cross was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, though prosecutors believed there might be additional victims whose disappearances had never been connected to foul play. The evidence was overwhelming. Leonard's defense attorney attempted to argue insanity, but psychiatric evaluations concluded that while Leonard had profound personality disorders, he understood the nature and consequences of his actions. He was legally sane, just monstrous. Marcus testified for 2 days, walking the jury through the investigation, the discovery of Sarah's remains, the symbols, the journal, the final search. He looked at Leonard during his testimony, trying to understand what drove someone to such evil. Leonard stared back with those cold, analytical eyes, as if Marcus were merely an interesting specimen. Catherine and Robert Mitchell testified about their daughter, humanizing her beyond the forensic evidence and crime scene photographs. Catherine's voice broke as she described Sarah's love of wild places, how she'd sought beauty and solitude in nature, how that love had been weaponized against her by a man who saw the wilderness as his hunting ground. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts, the judge sentenced Leonard Cross to 5 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. Montana had a death penalty, but it wasn't applied in this case due to various legal complexities. Leonard would die in prison, but he would die slowly, alone, marked by the system he'd tried to elude. As he was led from the courtroom, Leonard spoke his only public words about the crimes. He turned to look at Catherine Mitchell and said, "She saw the most beautiful sunrise. I gave her that gift." Then he was gone, led away in chains to a maximum security facility where he would spend the rest of his life. The years that followed were about healing, though some wounds never truly close. Catherine and Robert Mitchell established the Sarah Mitchell Foundation, dedicated to wilderness safety education and supporting families of missing persons. They worked tirelessly to ensure that other families wouldn't endure what they'd experienced, that Sarah's death might save lives. Marcus remained with the Flathead County Sheriff's Department until his retirement in 2008. The Mitchell case had changed him, tempered him in ways both good and troubling. He'd seen the darkest capabilities of human nature, but he'd also witnessed the resilience of people like Catherine Mitchell, who'd transformed grief into purpose. He and Jennifer had weathered the storm of his obsession, their marriage stronger for having survived it. Agent Torres went on to solve several other high-profile cases, but she never forgot the investigation that had led her through Montana's wilderness chasing a killer. She visited Whitefish occasionally, meeting with Marcus for coffee, 2 people bound by shared experience and the memory of victims they'd failed to save in time. Dale Pritchard, whose discovery of Sarah's remains had set everything in motion, eventually moved away from Montana, unable to shake the trauma of what he'd found. He settled in Oregon, took up fishing instead of hunting, and tried to make peace with the random cruelty of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or perhaps the right place, since his discovery had ultimately led to justice. The families of the other victims, Thomas Chen, Michelle Barker, Deborah Foster, James Nolan, finally had answers and closure. Memorial services were held, remains were buried properly, and something like peace was achieved, though tinged forever with the knowledge of how their loved ones had died. David Cross disappeared from public view after the trial, the guilt of his delayed revelation haunting him, despite assurances that he'd been a victim too, terrorized by his brother throughout childhood. The cabin where Leonard had lived was eventually torn down, the land sold to a conservation trust that promised it would remain undeveloped, a small piece of wilderness where no one would ever live again. Leonard Cross lived another 14 years in prison, never granting interviews, never expressing remorse, never explaining beyond what his journals had already revealed. He died of a stroke in 2014, aged 68, and was buried in an unmarked grave at the prison cemetery. No one attended his funeral except the required witnesses. The wilderness, where Sarah Mitchell and the others had died, remained beautiful and dangerous, indifferent to human tragedy. The trails continued to call to hikers seeking solitude and connection with nature. The mountains stood eternal, keeping their secrets except when chance, or a deliberate search, revealed them. Safety measures improved, technology made it harder for people to simply vanish, and Leonard Cross's legacy was a heightened awareness of the risks inherent in wilderness travel. But for Marcus, standing on the porch of his Whitefish home in the autumn of his retirement, looking toward the mountains that dominated the horizon, Sarah Mitchell remained present. He'd framed one of her photographs, the one from the damaged camera, showing her alive and smiling at a mountain vista, and hung it in his office. It reminded him why he'd become a deputy, why justice mattered, why giving up was never an option. Sometimes, on clear days, he would drive to the memorial that had been erected near Jewel Basin, a simple stone marker bearing the names of those who died in Montana's wilderness, including Sarah's. He'd stand there in silence, remembering her face in the photographs, her mother's trust, the weight of responsibility he'd carried. He'd remember finding her remains in that clearing, the symbols carved into bone, the long hunt for her killer. And he'd remember that evil exists but isn't inevitable, that justice is slow but can arrive, that even in the darkest cases, human connection and determination can prevail. The wilderness had taken Sarah Mitchell, but human courage and persistence had ensured her killer faced consequences. The mountains remembered, and so would he, for as long as memory lasted, for as long as the wind whispered through the pines, and the sun rose over peaks that had witnessed both terrible acts and the redemption that followed. Sarah Mitchell had sought beauty in wild places and had found death instead, but her story had ultimately led to the capture of a killer who'd hidden in those same wild places for 16 years. It wasn't the ending anyone would have chosen, but it was an ending. And sometimes, in a world that rarely offered perfect resolution, that had to be enough. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories.